Hello and welcome to another episode of the Brown Pundits Browncast. This is the 14th episode in our series of podcasts on the history of the Indian subcontinent. In this episode, we'll cover the period of what is commonly known as Delhi Sultanate. The episode will cover the various dynasties that make up for what is commonly known as the era of Delhi Sultanate. Our speakers in this episode are Dr. Omar Ali and Jay Singh. And hopefully at some point during the podcast, we'll be joined by Gaurav. Welcome to the episode, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marji.
Jay, how do we know about this period? What is our source of information on everything that we know about the Delhi Sultanate?
Delhi Sultanate as a part of Indian history during this period, there's this is quite special in terms of sources, because this is the period when we find that a new type of historical tradition has started in the Indian subcontinent. Particularly, we are talking about the Persian chronicles. So, for example, like those who do historical research. So this period provides us a lot of sources, and most of these sources are textual sources, literary sources, and so from the start of Delhi Sultanate, so most people believe that it was from the 1206 AD. So when Qutbuddin Aibak became the de facto ruler, from there traditionally it is believed that the era of the Delhi Sultanate starts. So from that period onwards, we have great number of sources. So for example, one of the earlier sources of the starting, particularly when we talk about the start of Delhi Sultanate or its emergence. So we have Tabaqat-e-Nasiri of Minasus Siraj. And then by the time of, let's say, Balban, we have not Balban, but before Balban, Nasiruddin Mahmud. During his reign, there was a text called Tariq-e-Firoz Shahi. So there is a whole list of Persian sources which we have about this period, and this makes the history of Delhi Sultanate quite unique. And in some sense, what we also see is that because of the fact that we have these large number of literary sources, what we also see is that in histories of Delhi Sultanate which we read, we do not have enough weightage given to the inscriptions and other important but less significant sources. So, for example, like those of we have covered the ancient period, and in ancient period, most scholars would be would be quite happy to have a small fraction of the kind of sources which we presently have on the Delhi Sultanate. So I think rather than going through the list of different sources, we just find that there are multiple literary sources, Persian, which are mostly written in Persian, and that we know from, that are from this period.
And Jay, just out of curiosity, I know we are all familiar with the Persian sources, and they are very extensive and many histories being written. That's why we know so many stories and things about this era. But what are the Indian sources? What do we know from the other side? Or how do we know things from the other perspective?
Yes, when we talk about the Indian sources, so we have, first of all, there are inscriptions in Sanskrit from the Delhi region itself and from other region itself, from different regions from where we can get some sense of the Indian rulers and how they thought about this period. Then we have grants also. But when we talk about literary sources, so for example, during the period of the late 12th century, so when the period of Prithviraj, we have the famous text Prithviraj Vijay. So this was the text which was written during the end of Prithviraj Chauhan's reign. And when we talk about, let's say, for example, the Chauhan rulers of Ranthambore, there is a Sanskrit text called Hamir Mahakavya. So Hamir Mahakavya tells the story of the struggle of Hamir, who was the Chauhan ruler of Ranthambore, and Alauddin Khilji. So in this text, we get mention of Alauddin Khilji, Jalaluddin, and even the two generals of Alauddin, Ulugh Khan and Nusrat Khan, are mentioned. Then there is another text in Old Rajasthani called Kanhadade Prabandh. So this text was written about the Jalor Chauhan rulers, and this text also describes the struggle between the Chauhan ruler and Alauddin Khilji. Then if we move to south, we have particularly at the start of during the Vijayanagar Empire, we have a text of I forgot the name, but it talks about the recovery of Madurai, which was captured by the Vijayanagar ruler. So these are some of the text, and so mainly we get like another interesting text is a text by a Tibetan Buddhist. So his name is Dharmaswami. So he traveled to India during the period when Bakhtiyar Khilji was active in the eastern UP and Bihar region. So he provides us great information about what was happening during this period. So these are some of the sources of, particularly if we say Indian in Indian languages.
Omar Sahab, Jay, so these are literary. This is literary evidence, right?
Yes.
Are there also traditions of oral histories? Are there communities that still survive? Especially Omar Sahab, if you've heard of anything like this, where these communities from generation to generation are carrying forward the tradition of oral histories, not necessarily written down somewhere, but the story is, history being told in form of stories. Have you heard anything?
I personally don't know anything about that. I haven't heard anything, but Jay may know something if there is such. I think they tend to be corrupted a lot in any case over such a long period. It would become mostly fantasy anyway.
There are some oral traditions, but they are not exactly of this period, like most of which that I know. For example, like Alha. Alha is an oral tradition that is prevalent in UP, Bihar, and even in some parts of Haryana, and particularly in the Madhya Pradesh region. So the whole Bundelkhand region, and from where I come, Eastern UP. So Alha tells the story of the two Rajputs who were from the Bundelkhand region. But this tradition talks about the fight between. So this is a slightly earlier tradition, particularly during the period of Prithviraj Chauhan. So this covers the reign of Prithviraj Chauhan. So I'm not sure about any other oral histories.
Right. So let's get started. Let's get started with the first dynasty that is, when we talk of Delhi Sultanate, the first dynasty that we really talk about is the slave dynasty. What are the origins? Who's the founder? Who are the early rulers? Jay, if you could take that.
So slave dynasty, or in another terms, Mamluk dynasty. So there is, this is not a single dynasty. So what we find is that, around 1206 AD, Mahmud Ghori dies, and there are four prominent slaves of Mahmud Ghori that after his death, there is this struggle between the nobles of the Ghurid nobles and the slaves of Mahmud Ghazni. And what we find is that eventually the slaves has a upper hand, and they able to successfully divide among themselves the whole realm of Shamsuddin Ghori. So what we see is that Qutubuddin Aibak, who was one of the slaves of Ghori, so he gets the territory of most of the Indian territories and also Lahore. So Lahore becomes his center. Then there was this slave of Mahmud Ghori whose name is Kubacha. So Kubacha gets the region of Sindh, Multan, which was one of the important center, and Uch. So Uch is in Bahawalpur, which is in Pakistan. So these are the regions which come under the hand of Kubacha. Then what we see is that in the core territory of the Ghurids, which was Ghazni, another slave of Shamsuddin Gauri, whose name is Yalduz. So he gets this Ghazni region. Now, it was bound to happen that within these three powerful slaves, we find that there is this struggle of who will become who will control the territory. So around 1210 AD, Qutbuddin Aibak, because of we are told that he was playing some type of a early form of polo, so he died in this accident while playing this sport. And after him, there is this his son Aram Shah became the ruler. But eventually, what we find is that one of the slaves of Qutbuddin Aibak, whose name is Iltutmish, so he captures the throne of Delhi. And eventually, what we see is that it was during the reign of Iltutmish that Delhi Sultanate, or the Sultanate of Delhi, emerged as a prominent player. Because what happens is that Iltutmish not only defeats one of the slaves of Shamsuddin Gauri, whose name is Kubacha, who had control over the region of Sindh, but he also defeats Yalduz, who earlier had control over Ghazni. But what happens is that the Khwarezmian Shah defeats Yalduz from Ghazni. So Yalduz, comes to India, and finally Iltutmish defeats him in Tarain. So because of these victories, what happens is that Iltutmish was able to successfully consolidate his kingdom, and the Delhi Sultanate really begins from the reign of Iltutmish. So because of the fact that earlier we had slave of Shamsuddin Gauri who was ruling, and then we have the slave of Aibak, so who was ruling. So that is why it is called the Mamluk or slave dynasty. Now, another important factor which led to the consolidation of Iltutmish power over Delhi was that, first of all, this was also the period. So I didn't mention any dates. So the date of Iltutmish is there is this struggle. So from 1206 AD to 1210 AD, Qutbuddin Aibak reigned. And after Qutbuddin Aibak, we see that there was this small interim where the son of Qutbuddin Aibak, whose name is Aram Shah, so he reigned. But by the time of 1200 AD, we find that Shamsuddin Iltutmish was able to successfully secure his rule. So he ruled from 1211 AD to 1236 AD. Now, this was also the period when Mongols were, wreaking havoc in Central Asia. And because of this fact, that because of the Mongol menace, we find that there is this great migration of military personnel and even skilled scholars from Central Asia to Delhi. And this greatly helps Iltutmish in, first of all, consolidating his kingdom, and it also provided a skilled manpower, both in terms of military skills and also in other administrative skills. And finally, Iltutmish was also presented by the Abbasid Caliph. So he finally legitimizes the rule of Iltutmish. So because of these three factors, what happens is that Iltutmish becomes the sole ruler of the Muslim kingdom of Delhi, of India, which we call as Delhi Sultanate. So I think I will stop now, and then we can talk about the rulers who came after Iltutmish.
I wanted to add that, just to give people a sort of a sense of how this came about, to jump back a little bit and see what was happening in that region. The region what is now Afghanistan was the base of the Ghaznavi Empire, Mahmud Ghaznavi, who obviously raided into India many times and captured what is now West Punjab and had his rule for a long time in West Punjab, right? That Ghaznavid dynasty continued to rule for the next 150 years, gradually decaying. But even in their decay, there were Ghaznavid rulers who were raiding into India, going all the way to Agra and beyond and looting and whatever. So that business was continuing, but that dynasty had decayed. And one of their sort of vassals, the Ghauris, who are in central Afghanistan, they eventually overthrew the last Ghaznavid ruler and took over Afghanistan, right? And then started to move. These were two brothers. The elder brother held the homeland, and the younger brother got to go east. And Muhammad Ghori came in and met, the famous battle with Prithviraj Chauhan. The first one he lost, but then he came back a year later and defeated Prithviraj Chauhan, and that established the Ghori rule over northwest India. And these Ghoris are themselves people from central Afghanistan, but their model, the entire Muslim empires in these regions were really dependent on Turkish slave soldiers by this time, right? This was the whole model of how they used to recruit their armies. They would get slaves from the Turkic slaves from the steppe of Central Asia, who were very good horsemen, very good warriors, and they would be brought in as people who had no other loyalties, who did not have families anymore, did not have a homeland anymore, and who were entirely loyal to the Sultan or whoever had purchased them and brought them here, and would rise to high positions. So Muhammad Ghori in particular, he did not have any children of his own, and he relied heavily on these Turkic slaves of his, right, as his senior administrators and governors. And Qutbuddin Aibak was the one who consolidated rule in northwest India. And when Muhammad Ghori died without any children, his empire was split between these, as you mentioned, the 3 or 4 slave governors in different areas who all decided to become sultan themselves. And Qutbuddin Aibak himself only lasted 4 years and then died in that polo accident. So as Jay said, the real founder of the Delhi Sultanate is really Iltutmish, who is sort of the Augustus of the Delhi Sultanate. He established the way, the headquarters in Delhi became standardized. And he, as you said, the Mongol refugees from the Mongols provided him with a lot of Persianate kind of elites who would then became the subordinate rulers under Iltutmish. And Iltutmish, interestingly, was supposed to be very good looking. And in fact, in Muslim chronicles, it's sometimes mentioned as Yusuf Sani, the second Yusuf. Joseph, the Prophet Joseph was supposed to be so beautiful that the Queen of Egypt fell for him and whatever. So Iltutmish had that kind of reputation as a very handsome, good-looking, and capable young man. And he lived up to that reputation, right? He established the Delhi Sultanate, put it in place. And when we look at the Delhi Sultanate these days, there is always going to be this issue of how to portray it, right? Is it purely colonial enterprise, foreigners from Afghanistan invade India, capture it, and rule it as a colony? Or is it an Indian dynasty? I think the weight is more in favor of a colonial dynasty at that point, but their own propaganda about themselves tended to be much more Islamic, jihadi kind of, how they are subduing the infidels and so on. But in practice, of course, this is a vast land with many, many more people than lived in all of Afghanistan, right? More people probably lived in Lahore Suba than lived in all of the other territories of the Ghoris. So this land, they did not subdue it with the same, they could not rule it in the fashion that they portrayed in their propaganda. They did have local rulers were taken in as vassals. They took them in even as generals and sometimes as administrators. So when somebody tries to portray this history, you have options. You can, how you frame it can change. Which framing is best tends to depend on what your current needs are, right? The people who are trying to portray kind of a syncretic Indo-Muslim, kumbaya, happy time will tend to emphasize those aspects, and the people who are portraying, who are right now fighting for, let's say, Hindu revival in India, will portray it as this obviously colonial invasion which was resisted by the Hindus. So I'm just bringing this in because this will come up later also, and Jay can comment more about what professional historians say about this. But this is an important aspect of this era, is not just to remember who ruled from when to when, but how do we sort of see this culturally and socially, how that transformation happened, and how do we portray these people today? So Jay, any comments about that?
Yeah, and Jay, before that, just to sort of help you with that comment, what are the primary sources saying? So if there is a biography, authorized biography of these rulers, or an autobiography written by them, what are they saying themselves? How do they see it? Later historians can interpret it, or texts written 200, 300 years down the line may have different takes on them. But what was going through their mind? How did they see themselves? What do the primary sources, biographies and autobiographies, tell us?
So sources, particularly, these Persian sources, they have a more rather militaristic view of the whole situation. So the destruction of kafirs and destruction of temples. So these are all mentioned in these sources. Now, scholars, particularly those scholars who view these acts of destruction, particularly of temples, they interpret these descriptions to a certain extent that these destruction of temples were not religious acts. Instead, it was a political act. So this is the famous argument of one of the prominent scholars, Richard Eaton. So he argues that the fact that these temples were destroyed was the main reason behind these destruction was not religious. Instead, it was a political. There was this political reasoning. So he argues that because temples were not only places of religious worship, but they was also a source of legitimacy for the Hindu rulers. So because to destroy that legitimacy, these temples were destroyed. Now, this is the argument which is presented by one side of the historians. Then other would say that that when you look at the instances of destruction of temples, we find that it is true that some of the temples were attached to the royal dynasties, but there were also other pilgrimage centers that were destroyed. So how should we view these destruction? Now, this, as Umar Saab has said, that this is a very complex history, and I personally find that there are these two extremes. So on one hand, everything was religious, and on the other hand, you have everything was done because it was a political act. Now, I think that there was a middle ground. There was some cases these destruction were political, but there were other instances as well where we find that the reason behind these destruction was mainly religious. So I think in that way, if I have to summarize this whole issue.
Right. And I think it's worth emphasizing that there is Richard Eaton, for example. I read his book, India in the Persianate Age, and the book has a very apologist tone to it. It's like the writer is just obsessed with trying to show that people who are portraying this in what he considers the wrong manner are wrong, and what he is doing is correcting their mistakes by pointing out. And so he goes looking for these things, but it has this order of like somebody is looking for evidence after having already made up his mind, right? Like about the temple destructions, he is just on the hunt for any example anywhere of one idol being stolen or one temple being destroyed by a Hindu ruler conquering another Hindu ruler. And then this will be repeated endlessly as an example of the fact that, oh, we all know that temples were destroyed by anybody who conquered a land, because that was the center of the sacred kingship. But as Jay said, in some cases that may be true, but those temples would then be restored, new idols would be installed, the social system, the culture, and the religion would not change. On the other hand, in the case of the Delhi Sultanate, there is obviously a huge change. These people are not interested in replacing that temple's idol with their own idol or something, right? They are interested in destroying it and replacing it with a very different system and a very different religious and cultural kind of milieu. So I think, again, the historians who are trying to do this, maybe they're doing it with good intentions because their focus is on what is happening today, right? They want to prevent what they think is a coming civil war or oppression or genocide or something. I think that's the sort of positive spin you can put on it. There are other spins you can put on it as well. But I don't think that we should take these historians necessarily as the last word on this. Especially Eaton, I think, is just too obsessed with trying to correct the historical record in a way that favors his particular ideological preferences in this stage, not necessarily what was happening. Because the literary evidence from the Delhi Sultanate is very clear. Whatever their actual pragmatic decisions, they may have taken Hindus as generals, as administrators, as governors, because that was the most convenient or useful way to handle things. But their propaganda was always very clear. They were the invaders who were going to cleanse this land of infidels and, replace it with the light of Islam and so on. If they did it less than perfectly, that's obviously real life is much more complicated than propaganda. But that was part of their intention, and it did show in a lot of their actions as well.
I think I will add to what Umar Saab has just said. Like, if you look at, if you see how, the Delhi Sultanate itself emerged, so one has to, really understand the situation of that period. So this here was a kingdom which was surrounded by a hostile, there was these state that were, they were in an alien land surrounded by powers that were, very quick to destroy them. So on one hand, you had to have a sort of a ideology, a militant ideology that would enable you to resist and in most cases even, extend your boundaries. And on the other hand, you also has to accommodate these because since you are a minority, you have to accommodate these people who are not of your religion. So there are instances where we find that in some cases there is this process of accommodation. Then there are also there are instances where we see that there are like destructions of temple. This case of going to conquer infidel lands. So these are also part of that ideology of that period of this state that has emerged.
Sure.
Yeah, one slight question actually from my side. Yeah, so we were talking about the older historians like Omar Saab mentioned about Richard Eaton. So how much has the history by these popular historians and the earlier historians like R.C. Musumdar, so how much of the history was based on primary sources, and how much of the history was more of a laissez-faire affair, like more opinionated, like, so how has that been has that change happened in the history writing, especially for the Sultanate period?
So I think if we look at like Richard Eaton is a present scholar. So most of these present scholars argue that the older historians, particularly national historians like R.C. Majumdar and other scholars like Jadunath Sarkar also. So these older nationalist historians, according to these present scholars, were taking the literary evidence literally. So they did not try to understand the motivation behind why the authors of these texts wrote what they wrote. Whereas what these present scholars argue that we have to first understand the intentions behind what was written. So, for example, if Barani in his Tariq-e-Firoz Shahi tells us about how infidels should be destroyed and instances of conversions or destruction of temples. So you should understand these descriptions in a way that this particular author is trying to portray his ruler as a quote unquote ideal Muslim ruler. But when we look at the situation on the ground, it was not the same as it is portrayed in these literary texts. So there is this analysis or meta-analysis of these texts that is being done by the present scholars. Whereas in the case of early historians, they took the description literally, as these present scholars argue.
Right. But I would only add that while this makes perfect sense, I think that literary records from that age are clearly very exaggerated, right? Every battle is between hundreds of thousands of cavalry, and every time 500,000 people are slaughtered by the great Sultan. Those numbers don't make sense in any case, right? These are not such huge empires. They don't have that kind of manpower in their armies. But at the same time, they do reflect an attitude and preferences of the rulers. And the other question that arises is that the same scholars who are very keen to sort of put in context what happened in 1215 from one side will not necessarily take that stance. Why can't you, for example, look at the English occupation of India in the same way? Were they colonists, or were they, half of them in the first phase were people who had semi-Indianized, right? And the East India Company could be treated as just another Indian power that took over India from other Indian powers. These are all ways of framing that history, but they are not that generous with other people as they are with the Delhi Sultans, and that always makes me a little bit suspicious, because it's like a sort of a one-sided attempt to correct the balance.
I think these ideological wars are what makes history conflicting, and that's why the more we read, the more we hear, and the more we get to know of various strands that existed, I think in some way improves our understanding better. Moving on.
I just wanted to add one thing, that, of course, there's always the other possibility. You can read someone like, I remember many years ago reading D.D. Kosambi's book about Indian history. And this is written from a Marxist perspective. And so everything he will tell you is, the real thing that happened was that the climate changed or the famine happened. And Aurangzeb, for example, is living in a time when there is the feudal system has decayed, and the Mughal Empire is therefore in crisis. But his response or his propaganda takes the form of, I am cracking down on infidels, or I am trying to restore Islamic purity. But what is really driving it is an economic crisis, or a crisis in administration and a decay in the empire, not so much anything to do with Islam or un-Islam. So that argument you can always make, that you can make about any period in history, right? That the propaganda and the framing and the description that is being given, ideological description that is being given, is just fluff on top of a real economic sort of base. That is the real heart of the matter. That's the whole Marxist idea, right? And it has some truth to it, probably.
Right. I remember you saying in one of the podcasts that narratives are to facts what constellations are to stars, right? There are innumerable facts, and one can draw any set of conclusions or paint any set of narrative.
But still, some conclusions will be better than others. So I think we should aim to try at least to get closer to the truth.
Yeah, I mean, so just a casual point. So we can see, if an economy is growing and shrinking, growing and shrinking, growing and shrinking, but at end of 100 years, we can say whether it has grown or shrunk. right? So it may have shrunk many times and grown many times, but the final outcome, like the proof is in the pudding. So
Right.
certain things are like incontrovertible.
So
Right.
let's get back to sort of
Yeah, moving on, Jay. So one can obviously name the successors of Iltutmish, or our listeners can obviously check out Wikipedia. But tell us a couple of more prominent ones. The most prominent one are also thanks to Hindi movie. A Hindi movie in popular imagination is possibly, at least to my knowledge, the only woman to have ruled India from Delhi till Indira Gandhi, Razia Sultan. And
yeah,
what's the what's the what were the administrative or some of the foundations that the slave dynasty put in place that enabled the successive rulers or dynasties to sort of survive till the British finally walked in?
So I think in that sense, I think there was politically or structurally they did not. For example, there was this ICTA system. So revenue assignments were given. So for example, the ICTA of Awadh. So a military commander was appointed in Awadh. So he had he had his own contingent, and there was this fixed amount that was fixed. So one has to send this fixed amount to the center, and then one can use the remaining amount for his own army. So this ICTA system, in a sense, one of the main factors behind the expansion of Delhi Sultanate. So there was this, the advantage for a local governor was that he had to acquire more and more land so that he could have his revenue increased. So, but the ICTA case also was pretty bad for the peasants, because you are just the governor just want to extract as much revenue from you as he can. And what happened after the death of, let's say, a governor was that this ICTA did not transfer to his son. It went back to the center, and another new governor was appointed. So in that way, we can say that structurally the Sultanate was not based on a very solid foundation, so as to, and this had, one of the main reason why this happened, because the Sultanate ruler did not wanted to create a landed aristocracy of the Muslims. So in order to avoid that and to keep power in the center, they had this whole arrangement. So I think in that way, we can say that this is one of the most important features of the Delhi Sultanate. About Razia Sultan, she ruled for 4 years, and she had a pretty tragic death. So, and I don't think there is, apart from she being a female ruler, his reign is not very significant in terms of history. I would just add that. But
so what's up? How is the slave dynasty taught in schools in Pakistan? How is it looked upon at, and who are the protagonists who are taught about?
Oh, in Pakistan, the Delhi Sultanate is the charter state of Pakistan, right? Pakistan is the successor of the Delhi Sultanate. So Pakistan history, Pakistan is it's a very prominent part of our history is just the Delhi Sultanate, because that is the establishment of Muslim rule in India. And Pakistan is sort of the successor of that Muslim rule, right? So all these people are great heroes. Qutbuddin Aibak, Iltutmish, Razia Sultana is sort of mentioned as this female queen. People who are relatively modern like to play that up, because you can't miss an opportunity to have a Muslim who is also female ruling in that era. But other than that, it's mostly just, it's good for movies and stuff, but she didn't do much, as you said, or couldn't. She was probably capable enough. Contemporary records have said about her, I forget which historian, I think Hassan Nizami, that she had every qualification for a ruler except one, that she was female. Right? She was not a man. Otherwise, she was probably capable enough. But then Balban is the next big figure. We learn about Ghiyasuddin Balban and how he consolidated the empire and so on. Balban is the next big figure in the Delhi Sultanate, right? Once the problem with all these Turkic kingdoms was that they did not have primogeniture and a very well-established system of how to pass on the dynasty. Instead, they still relied on the old step idea that the next generation should fight it out, and the most capable person should win. So every ruler's death is followed by a civil war. And this same pattern held there too, and so dynasties didn't last very long. So Iltutmish's own dynasty basically ended with once Razia Sultana died, his useless sons were sort of kept around by the Turkish nobles. Had a kind of a parliament or consultative body called the Chahalgam, the 40 senior nobles supposedly. And these senior nobles ruled in the name of Razia Sultana's brothers, who were mostly interested in just wine and whatever. But then that dynasty, their last ruler, his slave Balban became one of his generals became his chief minister, right? And so from 1246 to 1266, Balban really ruled the Delhi Sultanate as chief minister, while the king was supposedly the Iltutmish's son or grandson, I think, a younger son. And
grandson.
Grandson. And then 1266, that guy died, and Balban then took over and declared himself Sultan. I think the significant thing about Balban is that he was a very harsh and effective ruler, and built pyramids of skulls like these people used to do. But he also started this kind of Persian Shahanshah tradition in India, where the king was really completely above everyone else. The Sultan, nobody could smile in his laugh in his presence. People would prostrate themselves in front of him. He was called Zille-Ilahi, the shadow of God on earth. This whole business of Zille-Ilahi started with Balban, so that's his significant contribution to the future. And then, of course, when he died, the same thing happened to him. His son continued to rule Bengal for a while. His grandson, whom he had nominated as Sultan, lasted only a couple of years, and then his general overthrew him. So Jalaluddin Khilji basically overthrew Balban's descendants and took over and started the Khilji dynasty. The significance in the Khilji dynasty, I think, one is that they were Afghanized Turks, right? They were Turkic in origin, but they had been in Afghanistan for a long time and had sort of become more Afghanized, and then had been in India for a while by that point. So their Turkishness was less than the first slave dynasty people. And they were the ones who made it more an Indo-Afghan, Turco-Afghan elite rather than just a Turkic elite. Or at least that's what I remember. Jay can correct me if I'm wrong about that. And of course, Jalaluddin Khilji, same thing happens to him. He is overthrown by his nephew, Alauddin Khilji, who became one of the big powerful rulers of the Delhi Sultanate and expanded it into the south. He captured, Gujarat, Devgiri, whatever, conquered much more land. Was a very effective ruler again. And the interesting thing about him is that he was one of those rulers who was successful enough that he started thinking that I should become God. People should worship me, or I should start a new religion. He was supposedly dissuaded. In Pakistan, I remember even a TV serial that was about this event. But that happened in Alauddin Khilji's reign. But he was very cruel, very harsh, but also very effective. Right? And he's again credited with saving India from the Mongols, which is sort of an odd thing, because I don't think there's that much difference between what the Mongols did and what the Turks did. It would have been one of the, 6 of one and half dozen of the other or whatever. But he did stop the Chagatai Mongols from getting into India and left behind a very powerful state, but it immediately fell apart after his death. Right? Then another dynasty starts when, in turn, one of his governors takes over, and then the Tughlaq dynasty started. And I'll let Jay step in and correct some mistakes or give us an outline of what happened next.
Jay, before you start, what is the language of the court? So with the slave dynasty, is it now Persian? That's the language that's used for all official work and official communication.
Yes, because most of these Turks were Persianized Turks. Although what some scholars have argued that when we have this, migration of Persians from Central Asia to Delhi Sultanate during the reign of Iltutmish. So there is this, what you can say is some type of a contestation between the Turks and the Persians. So the Turks were considered by Persians as uncultured, boorish. So this was the image of the Turks that Persians had. So it was in the literature. There is this two class which we see. So first is the men of letters, which is called Ahle Kalam, and men of sword. I think Umar Saab, it is called Ahle Shifa.
Which thing is called Ahle Shifa? Sorry.
Ahle Kalam, men of letters, and men of sword.
Oh, I am not sure what it can't be Shifa. Saif is sword. I don't know if it's Ahle Saif.
Ahle Saif, yes.
Yeah, that would be.
So this, this tension, cultural tension is there between the Persians and the Turkish. And one of the main reasons was also that these Persians had come from a tradition where there was this tradition of landed aristocracy and hereditary authority, whereas for the Turks it was whoever has the most power. So this tension is present in the early phases between the Turks and the Persians. And we also see that in the early phases, some of the Persians, particularly these men of letters, had to learn Turkish to follow the proceedings, right, because most of these main people were Turks and they conversed in Turkish. But by the time of, let's say, the later rulers, it was Persian that had come to dominate the court of Delhi Sultanate. Also, we should also remember that from the time of Iltutmish, there was constantly Mongol raids that is going on. And the Mongols are, every 4 or 5 years or every other decade, there is this Mongol threat. So, for example, one of the sons, crown prince of Balban, he died during one of the struggle between Mongols. So his name was, I think, Muhammad. So he died fighting in Punjab. So this we have to keep in mind that this Delhi Sultanate is in a situation when on the one hand it is fighting the Hindu kingdoms, and on the other hand from the west there is always this Mongol threat that is there.
And since it's Persians and the Turks, is there also a Shia-Sunni conflict? What do we know about origins of that conflict in the subcontinent, Omar sir?
At this point, these were Sunni Turks, the dominant, the Shias. In fact, the first invasion that Muhammad Ghori launched into India was not aimed at any Hindu kingdom. It was aimed at Multan, which at that time was a Shia, I think one of the unorthodox Shia sects, Ismaili sects running Multan. So there was, the Shias were considered almost like infidels by these people. These were more orthodox Sunni. In fact, Muhammad Ghori himself, there is a legend that, Muhammad Ghori died in 1206. He was still not that old. He was assassinated. And there are various versions of who assassinated him. I think the Khokhars are blamed also from Punjab, other people. But one of the legends is that he was assassinated by a Fidain assassin from the assassins, the people, followers of Hassan ibn Sabah from Alamut, the Ismaili stronghold in Iran. They had run this kind of international assassination business, and that one of their assassins killed him because of his anti-Ismaili actions. So Shias were not at all prominent at this point. I think Shia basically, as part of the ruling elite, did not really happen until Mughal times. Before that, there may have been some, but they were not. In the Delhi Sultanate itself, it was Orthodox Sunnis who dominated. We can also talk about a couple of other cultural things that were going on. Along with the invasion and the military rule came the Sufis, right? The Sheikhs and Sufis were the ideological warriors of Islam at that point. And they operated in parallel and not necessarily in unison with the rulers, sometimes in opposition to them also. But these people arrived from Central Asia as well. People like Ali Hajweri, who became Data Ganj Bakhsh in Lahore, later on Nizamuddin Auliya, very famously in the Khilji time. So these people had a kind of a Sufi, have their own theory of how the world is run. And in their view, the real rulers of the world are these spiritual sheikhs who sort of stay behind the scenes, but they are the ones who grant kingship to kings. So kings, especially when they were in trouble, human beings being what they are, would go and look for these Sufis and try to get their blessings. And if they happen to win after that blessing, they would, like Akbar, walk barefoot to Chishti, Moinuddin Chishti's shrine, and so on. So these people did go to these shrines. The royal families tried to patronize them at various points, but these shrines became centers of a kind of mystical Islam also, and became centers of conversion, where a lot of local people converted at the hands of these Sufis. So that's one aspect that we can have Jay also comment on. The other is the rise of kind of Indo-Persian literature, right? And the classic or the central figure in that, you might say, is Amir Khusro. And Amir Khusro is also a good example of another phenomena that is starting to happen at this point, which is that genetically these people are becoming mixed, even if ideologically they are not that mixed. Amir Khusro's dad came from Central Asia, but his mom was Rajput, and he was born in UP. So he is the kind of a representative of what happened later with the Mughals as well, of the descendants of or rulers associated with the rulers, but genetically at least half Indian. And his obviously innovations in music, in literature, in poetry are very well known. And he is a figure also in the development of Hindavi, right? The earlier forms of Hindustani language. And you can see how these cultures are sort of melting and combining in new ways also, because this language is the language of basically North India that is now being somewhat Persianized and mixed with the Persian and Turkic words, and becomes what later became Hindustani and then Urdu and Hindi and so on. So we can talk about these people as well, the cultural.
I vaguely remember reading somewhere, and Jay and Omar Saab, you could sort of chip in and correct me. Is Amir Khusro the inventor of the popular musical instrument tabla?
I don't know. I think I've heard this legend, but I don't know if this is thought to be true at all.
Jay, what have you heard?
I do know that in India itself, the percussion instrument of choice would be the two-sided drum, right? The
dhol.
The dholak or the mridang.
The dholak or exactly. But the tabla is innovation around this time. Whether Amir Khusro was the one who started it or not, I have no idea. I don't know that much about the history of instruments and music. But he's also credited, of course, with the invention of Qawwali, which he may have done. That may be so, and was a conscious attempt to mix Indian musical tradition with kind of Central Asian Islamic ideological poetry.
Right. Jay, what is the role of the Hindu elite at this time during the slave dynasty? How has the dynasty co-opted large Hindu families, the administrators? Are they an active part of the administration? What is the role of the Hindu elite?
I don't think there was much contribution of the, let's say, prominent kings during the early phase also, because there are multiple inscriptions from the different regions where we learn that in most cases, first of all, like the consolidation of the whole, when we look at the map, so the Sultanate starts from, let's say, Afghanistan, and it goes all the way east to Bengal. But on the ground, the consolidation or the power of the Delhi Sultanate did not reach particularly in the hinterland. So there are, inscription from, let's say, in Magad in Bihar, where we have some Hindu ruler who claims that he is the, sole authority here. So in the early phases, particularly, I don't think there was this much co-option of the Hindu rulers. It happened in a later period. And there is also this view particularly among old scholars, that especially after the death of Iltutmish, there was this, a Hindu pushback, and there are multiple instances. For example, the Eastern Ganga dynasty that ruled Odisha. So they they not only tried, but they actually conquered all the way up to Lakhnauti. Lakhnauti was the, one of the capitals of the Sena kingdom that was conquered by Bakhtiyar Khilji. So Bengal, up to Bengal, these Odisha rulers of Odisha had, penetrated. And we have, so this happened around 1243. And even by the time of 1296 AD, these Eastern Ganga rulers had control over this region. And the interesting part about this, particularly this phase, which old scholars have called the Hindu aggression, is that it was only by the time of Balban who really tried to, control some of these rulers. But he was also not very successful. So, for example, I had discussed about the Ranthambore. So Iltutmish was able to conquer Ranthambore, but after his death, the Chauhans were able to retake Ranthambore. And what is interesting is that presently we think of Mewat as a Muslim-dominated area, but during the reign of Balban and even earlier, it was the center of Jadhav Bhatti Rajputs. So in most of these sources, what we find is that the Chauhans and these Jadhav Bhatti Rajputs had some type of a relation between them. And there are instances where we are told that these, so in the Persian sources, these are called Mewatis. And we think of them as, these were present day Mewatis, but that is not the case. So we are told that they were able to penetrate as far as the suburbs of Delhi. So there was this raids on Delhi. So these were not a massive raids, but the fact that they were able to, come to the suburbs of Delhi suggests that particularly after the death of Iltutmish, the power of the Delhi monarchs had significantly weakened. And particularly thanks to Balban and most importantly Alauddin Khilji, that the Sultanate was able to, retake most of the lost territory, and in the case of Alauddin, extend the kingdom quite, extensively. So this, I think, is one of the important aspect of this period that is not discussed much, because we think that, from the start of Iltutmish's reign, there was this period of conquest, but this is a small instance where we can see that there was not always, success. There were also cases where the Delhi Sultanate had to, was at a back foot, if we can say this.
Right. I think we can say that the conquest of this area by these Turkic horsemen, there does imply some superiority, especially in cavalry, a sort of a military superiority that was not total. Obviously, even Prithviraj won his first battle against Muhammad Ghori, so it's not like they always won, right? They lost several battles, but they did have an advantage. They were better cavalry and armored cavalry than anything that existed in India in the Indian kingdoms at that time, and that advantage over time gave them the edge. Even if they lost, they would usually get it back. And I think one of the sort of striking examples of that is Bakhtiar Khilji's conquest of Bengal. Bengal is not a small territory, and he came with a few thousand horsemen and conquered the whole place and then held on to it. There was some element of that, but there was also pushback. And I think that the ruler from Orissa, wasn't his name Narsimha? Was it, is that the one who pushed back?
Yes, Narsim first and even Narsim second. So there is this inscription that there is this grant that was made by Narsim second in around 1296 AD. So this was made on the banks of Ganga. So this, so he was situated on a military camp. So this tells us that, they were able to penetrate as far as Bengal. And interestingly, Umar Sahab, when, Bakhtiar Khilji conquered Bengal, so he issued a coin. So in the coin, you have a Sanskrit inscription of sorts, which is Gaud Vijay, so victory over God. And the symbol which is present in this coin is a Turkish cavalryman who is holding a mace. So in their mind also, they knew that this, cavalry, particularly heavy cavalry, had great advantage that they enjoyed. And also, I think one important reason, which in my view is the factor of why they were so successful, is that they had no option but to succeed, because otherwise they were surrounded by.
Yeah, right. And also, I think we have to admit, or at least I think, that Islam itself, as Orthodox Islam as a religion, is sort of a martial religion stripped to its essentials. It works well for that purpose. And so that itself provided a sort of an advantage also. Even though they regularly fought each other, every king is overthrown by his own son and nephew and whatever, but there is an overall some asabiya also, some common feeling which holds these people together versus their enemies. And it had some impact. Anyway, on Alauddin Khilji, another side light is the fact that he's the one, when he conquered Warangal, took the Kohinoor diamond, right? So that's where the Kohinoor diamond sort of enters into the hands of the Delhi Sultanate. Later on ended up with the Mughals, and then of course went to Afghanistan and came back to Ranjit Singh and so on. But he's the one who got it from Warangal.
Right. So moving on, let's talk about the Khiljis. It's the end of the slave dynasty. Jay, what do we know about the origins of Khilji dynasty, and who were the two most prominent rulers who spread the Delhi Sultanate?
So as Umar Sahab has just said, that they were Afghanized Turks. So Khalji tribe used to rule southern Afghanistan, and they were greatly employed by the Ghurids in their army. And for example, one of the first ruler of the Khalji dynasty, Jalaluddin Khilji. So his career started as a petty soldier, and eventually he, by the time of during the reign of Balban, he became the Kotwal of Delhi, not Kotwal of Delhi, but he was granted the Iqtidari of Samana. So, the rise of Jalaluddin Khilji was because of his personal achievements. So he started from as a petty soldier, as I mentioned. So he ruled for a brief period, 4 years, and finally he was murdered by his nephew, Alauddin Khilji. And Alauddin Khilji really, I think, and interestingly, he ruled for 20 years. So 4 years more than Iltutmish. And this 20 years, this was the period, when the military, particularly his military might, was at its peak. And there were also one of the main reasons why he was able to succeed in military conquest was, first of all, he was a brilliant general. And also, I think the fact that, in the previous raids in the reign of Jalaluddin Khilji, as a commander, the raid on Warangal and Devgiri particularly not the Devguri particularly. So the raid of Devguri made him pretty rich. And because of this, he was able to consolidate his power. And when he murdered Jalaluddin Khilji, the kind of expansion that happened afterward was really, because you find that these Turkish soldiers were able to penetrate as deep as Madurai. So this, I think, is one of the most militarily, I think, is a brilliant example of how much advantage they enjoyed in the militarily sense.
Yeah, didn't he call himself Sikandar
Sani, the second
that Alexander come again?
Yes.
Every second person used to call himself Alexander Sani. This seems to happen regularly. Alexander doesn't leave the imagination of Central Asians, Iranians, whatever. Always Sikandar is the archetypal great hero, right?
All the way to Prakash Mehra, who made a movie called Mukaddar Ka Sikandar in the late 1970s. I think Sikandar's true legacy is the memory that he's left behind in the subcontinent.
Right, and while we are on movies, Alauddin Khilji is obviously also the ruler for about whom Padmavat was written and the movie made. I haven't seen the movie; I have no idea.
Right.
So just one question, Jay. We hear about Alauddin Khilji and his quote-unquote reforms and agrarian reforms and whatnot. So maybe you can talk about that. That is a often neglected part.
So these are, in history books is called the market reforms of Alauddin Khilji. So basically, he fixed the prices of grains, horses, cattle, etc. And one of the reasons which historians give why he did this was first to maintain a large army. So what happened was that because of this expansion, and particularly because of the looting of the various temples and these kingdoms in the Deccan and South, the Delhi is, there is so much gold that is flowing into Delhi. So there is this inflation that happened. So in order to control the prices, this market reform was done. And it was also to maintain a large army. So there are these three markets which he assigned. So first was the food market, then the second was cloth market, and herbs and etc. were bought in this second market. The third was for horses, cattle, and slaves. So we should also remember that the Turkish Sultanate had great number of slaves, and in most wars we also find that great number of slaves were transported from India back to Central Asia. So I think this aspect is also we should remember.
And right. Is this movement of slaves from India to Central Asia gives background to the Hindu Kush mountains and why they are called the Hindu Kush? Or am I confused with something else?
We had a discussion on Twitter recently about that, and the consensus or the dominant opinion was that actually this is a misconception, and that the name comes from Indian Caucasus, which was what the Greeks called it, the Indo-Greeks. And this is sort of a
corruption
derivation of that. A corruption of the Hindu Kush comes from the the Hind Caucasus, that the Indo-Greeks called it. Richard Eaton, by the way, in his book, has a theory about, I think it is either Muhammad Tughlaq or Khilji, one of these people, an army sent into Afghanistan that died. He puts the name down to that one particular army, which I think is completely wrong. But that also tells you that famous historians not necessarily right about everything.
And what do we know about their encounters with Mongols? Khaljis.
So, particularly during the reign of Alauddin Khilji, so we think of the famous Battle of Kili that happened, I think, around 1301 AD. I think, yes. So Yes. But this was, there were multiple raids. So I think more than 4 or 5 raids that happened during the reign of Alauddin Khilji. But this raid particularly that happened, eventually, which was the Battle of Kili, in the outskirts of Delhi. There, the Mongols were badly defeated, and from that period onwards, we find that the kind of push that the Mongols, were to take in the earlier period. After this defeat, it was rarely, a small contingent of Mongols tried to penetrate India. There was no significant invasion that happened after this invasion.
And when we say Mongols in this context, we are talking about descendants of Genghis Khan.
Yes, Genghis Khan has already died during the reign of Iltutmish.
Right. So
and wasn't the Chagatai Mongols, and weren't they like not that powerful Mongols? Like
they never launched a very, nothing on the scale of Genghis Khan's invasions of Iran and Central Asia. There was no attempt at that size, but the attempt where Alauddin Khilji defeated them outside Delhi was relatively a major army, and that was a major victory for Alauddin Khilji. But other than that, I think it was relatively minor raiding bands who were pushed back. Alauddin Khilji also, if I remember correctly, Jay, had massacred a huge number of Mongols who had settled in around Delhi. There were Mongols who had been settled here and were living here as free people. For some reason, he massacred them. I can't remember what exactly happened. Killed tens of thousands of them.
Yes. I think something about seeing them as fifth column
right, something like that.
Yeah.
These are called. These were settled actually in Mewat, so these were called neo-Muslims. So he massacred them because he was worried that they could pose him is some type of a threat. So that is why they were massacred by Alauddin Khilji.
And coming to threats of neo-Muslims reverting, this is Alauddin Khilji's end is also an example of that. One of his generals, what was his name? Khusro, right? Khusro Khan was from Gujarat, I think, a Hindu who had been taken into his service and had converted to Islam and become one of his major generals. After the death of Alauddin Khilji,
Malik Kafur you are saying about, right?
No, not Malik Kafur.
Okay.
Malik Kafur was African, I think, right?
No. Malik Ambar was African. Malik Kafur was a Gujarati.
No, Umar Saab is talking about Khusro Khan, who was a Hindu convert who tried to, who also.
Khusro Khan was a general of Alauddin Khilji. Malik Kafur was earlier than Khusro Khan. I think already dead by that time. But anyway, after Alauddin Khilji's death, Khusro Khan briefly took over Delhi, and after becoming the ruler, reverted to Hinduism. Right, so he went back to being a Hindu. And in the contemporary Persian chronicles, there are scenes being described of how idols were being brought back into the palace, and how this is like complete desecration and whatever. And of course, the Turkish nobles immediately revolted. And after a few months, Khusro Khan was beheaded and lost power. But that was one attempt at reversion. So I think Alauddin Khilji massacring the Mongols may have had something like that in mind. The other example of not reversion, I think Himu never converted to Islam. But the other time, Hindu general managed to take back Delhi and try to establish himself as Vikramaditya is when Himu took over after Humayun's death.
Right.
I think
we'll come to that in the subsequent episodes. So Khaljis paved the way for Tughlaqs.
One brief comment that Khusro Khan, so he became prominent after Mubarak Shah. So Mubarak Shah was the son of Alauddin. So, and one interesting thing about Mubarak Shah is that he titled himself as Khalifullah, and he adopted the title of Caliph. But interestingly, when there was this coup that Khusro Khan organized, and after this, when he became the Sultan, so he massacred all the male members of Alauddin's family. So this is a rather morbid detail which I wanted to present. So
pretty grim end.
Also pretty typical, right? That's royal families are like that, and massacring all their male descendants is a glorious tradition that goes back 2,000 years or more.
Right. Tughlaqs. What do we know about them, Jay? Other than the fact that there is this sprawling fort in present-day Delhi called Tughlaqabad.
So Tughlaqabad was was built by the first ruler of the Tughlaq dynasty, whose name is Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq, and other than he made raids on different cities or kingdoms of Delhi Sultanate, or not Delhi Sultanate, Hindu kingdoms. I think one of the interesting aspects about Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq is that he did not had great relation with Nizamuddin Aulia. So what happened was that during the period of Khusro Khan, so Khusro Khan gave some donations to Nizamuddin Aulia, and in some sources we are told that it was something like 5 lakh tankas. So when Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq came to the throne, he wanted these donations or this money back, and Nizamuddin Khilji refused to. Not Nizamuddin Khilji. Nizamuddin Aulia refused to do so, and since he was a great Sufi saint, he couldn't do anything. But Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq and the relation between Nizamuddin Aulia from that period onwards was not really great. So, for example, there is this famous saying about the Tughlaqabad fort itself that I think the saying goes like that Nizamuddin Aulia had said that either this city will remain abandoned or either it will be inhabited by the Gujars. So this I think is an important. And he was also also this phrase of Dilli Durast, which he said to Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq.
Right. And for those who are interested, the present-day Delhi, the area in and around Tughlaqabad Fort, is actually inhabited by a lot of Gujars. Right. Moving on.
Yeah. So the most interesting person in the Tughlaq dynasty is Muhammad Tughlaq, right? Who took over from his dad, and then I think dad died in. This is the one who died in the crash of the pavilion, right, Jay?
Yes.
It's a review pavilion where he was watching the army crashed and killed him, and of course people suspect that Muhammad Tughlaq arranged it. And became the Sultan. But he was a mix of, new ideas and crackpot ideas and great ideas and ruthlessness and cruelty with a lot of generosity. So it's a very contradictory figure. One of the reasons we know about him is that Ibn Battuta came to his court and was at his court for a few years. He appointed him a judge and gave him a lot of money. But after a while, Ibn Battuta had figured out that this man can any day also turn around and have you skinned alive. So he slipped out while he had the chance. And Muhammad Tughlaq also introduced a token currency for the first time in India, which failed completely. But it was an innovation and a new idea. And even planned an invasion of China, they say. And there was, of course, he's the one who moved the capital or set up a second capital at Daulatabad in Devgiri, and tried to move people there, many of whom died on the way and some of whom died after getting there because he didn't arrange for enough water or the site did not have enough water. So an interesting and contradictory kind of figure, very cruel in many cases, but also very ambitious and with very high-flown ideas at times. And then when he died, he left the state in a mess, really. But his successor, Firoz Shah Tughlaq, was a much more sensible and low-key person. He ruled a smaller state than Muhammad Tughlaq, but he kept it intact and he did some good work, supposedly. But as is also typical, he was gentler. He stopped the tortures that were common in all these Turkic dynasties, people being flayed alive, people being crushed and, their bones being crushed with hammers and cut into pieces and so on. He supposedly ended these tortures. But at the same time, he was more orthodox. The Brahmins had been apparently exempted from jizya before that. Jizya was charged from all the non-Muslims except the Brahmins. But Firoz Shah Tughlaq extended it to Brahmins as well, and generally tried to make sort of Orthodox Islam more of a feature of his court, and tried to get, so more people started converting also, right? Credited or discredited, however you looked at it, but in our Pakistani version of history, obviously credited with the fact that he tried to make it a more Orthodox Islamic state.
Jay, Omar Saab just mentioned the term jizya. What is the origin of this term in Indian subcontinent, and what is the first instance of this tax being levied on non-Muslims, and how did this tax evolve during the Delhi Sultanate period?
I think it was back to the Arab rule over Sindh. So we have instances where jizya was levied by the Arab rulers, and like for example, this fact of after during the reign of Firoz Shah Tughlaq that Brahmins were not required to pay jizya, but we don't know exactly who was the main ruler who decided to exempt Brahmins. But in most cases, I think this jizya and pilgrim tax. So these were common features of the Indo-Islamic states, and it was only during the reign of, I think, during the reign of Akbar that he really put an end to this. Otherwise, there were small instances where some ruler may have tried to put an end, but I personally don't know about any instances.
So this was a regular tax, and
so it's a kind of a poll tax, right? It's a tax that's given per head, a tax charged on all non-Muslims as part of their, they are exempted from some from military service, but in return for the protection they are getting from the Sultan, they have to pay this tax. I think there is some argument that the early sultans really did not have the administrative machinery to actually collect this tax. They may have imposed it, and they may have even tried to collect some of it somewhere where they were really in charge, but it's doubtful that it was a major source of income for them. It was not that their administration was not that deep. It wasn't organized to the level where you could do a census and get every single Hindu to pay a tax, right? They didn't even know how many Hindus live under their kingdom. But they did have a jizya, and they did charge it. Of course, where it was easier to collect is pilgrim taxes, because if you hold if you're holding that land, pilgrims coming to Kashi or Banaras or whatever, they are going to be easy to tax, and they were taxed, except I think under Akbar, who relieved these taxes, and then Aurangzeb, of course, reimposed it.
Right. So finally, a Mongol makes it to Delhi, Taimur Lane, and brings the end of Tughlaq era. What do we know about that, Jay?
I think Taimur was not really a Mongol.
He did have some Mongol ancestry, didn't he?
He had some maternal side or something, I think, maybe, but he was Turk. Basically, he was a Turk. Yeah.
Turk with some Mongol ancestry. That's what I remember.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. In any case, he emulated the Mongols. That was his ideal, was Genghis Khan. So he was.
So I think before the invasion of Taimur, one thing we should understand that during the reign of Firoz Shah Tughlaq, one important step that he took, which eventually led to the downfall of Delhi Sultanate, was that firstly although he was a great ruler in the sense that he provided, general amenities to various travelers, etc. And he founded some cities as well. But what he did was that this Ikta system of revenue assignments before Firoz Shah Tughlaq, it was not hereditary. So after the death of a, let's say, Ikta holder, the Ikta went back to the main ruler and it was reassigned to someone else. Now this someone could be the son of the previous Ikta holder, but it was not really it was not the case that happened every time. But during the reign of Firoz Shah Tughlaq, he made this Ikta transfer hereditary. So because of this, one of the main reasons behind this, the decline of Delhi Sultanate, particularly according to some scholars, is that this step or this decision led to the creation of a powerful landed gentry, and it greatly weakened the central power of the state. So what happens is that after the death of Firoz Shah Tughlaq, which happened around 1388 AD, we find that his death was followed by 5 weak sultans, and this fifth sultan was the one during whose reign we find that Taimur has arrived. So Taimur starts his campaign in the late summer of 1398 AD. So he marches through Afghanistan and bypassing Kashmir. He crosses Indus in September, and there is this brief battle that happened at Panipat. So we are told that there was this 10,000 cavalry, Tughlaq cavalry, which was easily defeated by Taimur. So when he reached Delhi, so for a month, the Tughlaq ruler did try to put up a fight, but it was of no use. And for a month, we are told that he plundered Delhi, and there was this 80,000 people were massacred by him. And by the next year, January, he is back in Samarkand. So this was a brief period of this invasion, but this really weakened Delhi Sultanate. And after this invasion, what we see is that first of all, Deccan has become an independent sultanate of his own, and Bengal also became an independent state. Then another interesting point after this Taimur's invasion, which we see, is that Jaunpur, which is in eastern UP, which I think most of us don't even know about Jaunpur. But after Taimur's invasion, it really became one of the most important center of Islamic power in the Indian subcontinent. And famously, it was called Shiraz of East. And the Sharkis, Malik Sarwar, interestingly, was a slave. So he was a slave of African origin. So he was granted the area of Jaunpur, and since he was a slave and also a eunuch, so he didn't have any sons. So he adopted someone, and from his period onwards, the Sharki dynasty ruled Jaunpur. Sharki was because it was the region of Jaunpur was described as the land of the east. So Shark is east, and that is why it became the Sharkis.
Right. So the end of Tughlaq era sees the commencement of the Sayyid dynasty, right?
Right. Which is kind of the least known and least important of the Delhi Sultanate. By this time, as Jay said, the invasion of Taimur has really wrecked the Delhi Sultanate. Whatever remained of it is in very poor shape. And the Sayyids family took over. They claimed descent from the Holy Prophet. That's why they were called Sayyids. But the thought is that they were probably Khokhars from Punjab or something like that, not really Sayyids. But their rule was confined to really a small region around Delhi. And then at some 1440s, somewhere around 1450, the Lodhis take over. And Bahlol Lodhi, who was governor in Sirhind, then captured Delhi and started the Lodi dynasty. And the only thing I remember about Balol Lodi is that, like many of his famous predecessors, he also built towers of skulls. And the other thing notable about the Lodis, of course, is that they were the first Pakhtun dynasty. Right? This is the first time Pakhtuns or Pathans are ruling North India. And the Lodis took over. Balol was followed by Sikandar Lodi, and Sikandar Lodi was said to be a patron of the arts and whatever, and so a reasonably successful ruler. And he was followed by Ibrahim Lodi, but Ibrahim Lodi, there was infighting within the family, and Daulat Khan Lodi, his governor in Lahore, actually invited Babur to come and attack and take over from Ibrahim Lodi. And that's, of course, what led to the start of the Mughal era and the end of the Delhi Sultanate. Although some people might say that Sher Shah Suri was sort of a revival of the Delhi Sultanate and reflected like the revival of that older Delhi Sultanate crowd for a brief period before the Mughals came back again.
Right. I think one important fact which I would like to mention is that, before the Lodis, the last Sayyid ruler was Alam Shah. So he ruled for a period of 6 years. And in popular culture, there is this famous saying that Shahanshai Shah Alam as Dilli Tap Alam. So we hear this and we think of that this is a Shah Alam of the later Mughals. But actually, some scholars argued that this was this saying was for Alam Shah, and it portrays, how small how insignificant these later Delhi Sultanate was.
Right. I think that's in Eaton's book also, that Alam Shah, that this saying started with Alam Shah and not with Shah Alam II, who was in the 18th century.
Now, Omar, this is a time when the Western Europe's really waking up, right? They're coming out of the Dark Ages. Oxford University has already been set up, although a few centuries before this. But the early seeds of, the Dark Ages coming to an end are clearly visible in Europe. Universities are coming up. There is more curiosity. There is a sense of
this is the Renaissance, right? This is the period of the Renaissance.
This is the period of the Renaissance, right?
Yeah,
paving the way for Europe going around and colonizing the whole, Western Europe, becoming the master colonizers.
Why is just a minute, Manish. Sorry to interject. Yeah, before we go on to that, we didn't talk much about the Rajput resistance, like of Hamir or Rana Sangha or Rana Kumbha. Maybe Jay can quickly.
I'll come to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I thought
I was hoping to wrap up. I was hoping to wrap up the episode with what was happening with the Hindu kingdoms around this time.
Okay. Yeah.
But just to sort of coming back to this point, why didn't we sort of see that kind of a sense of inquiry, a scientific temper, or developments in the field of science and technology, and the kind of developments that we saw in Western Europe around this time? I'm sure I'm in the realms of speculation now, but still some thoughts.
Yeah, we'll see what Jay's sort of professional opinion is, but my impression is that these are, first of all, the Turkic rulers from all the way from the Ottomans to the Central Asian Seljuks, whatever, down to the Indians, down to the Mughals. These are military elites, and their obsession is with capturing power and holding on to it. And after every king dies, they have another civil war to decide who holds it next. These are not the same thing as a kingdom with an elite and a people who are a little bit joined to each other and have a common history kind of thing, and who have interests beyond just taking power and holding on to it. Some of them did have interest beyond it, but not a lot. And it was primarily a military aristocracy interested in plunder and interested in ruling over people whom they considered very, very far beneath them, right? Whether they were Muslims or Hindus, they would say the propaganda was obviously much more against Hindus, but their treatment of the Hindus who managed to convert to Islam did not get treated much better either. The peasants were just a source of taxes for them. This was not the kind of empire from which great things were expected, I think, in the first place. And then the fact of it being a colony is also, I think, has a role. I am, in my old age, finally sort of thinking that there is something to this. I can't think of a colony that really produced these kinds of developments and progress. There needs to be some sort of a common feeling and a more normal country, not a colony. So India was a colony, and this colony did not produce what was going on in Europe. That was not their direction. They never even approached that direction.
Omar sir, have you read Verge by Patrick Wyman?
Yes.
Yeah, so he covers a lot of this from printing press and Martin Luther.
Right.
So yeah, so isn't one of the reasons why the Islamic culture did not catch up with the Western European was that printing Arabic and the Persianate languages are not printing friendly. So that is.
I don't think that's. I think people trying to no one factor is going to be everything, right?
Yeah.
And especially not a factor like this. I think printing is very downstream to other things. The fact that they did not take up the printing press is itself a sign of there being a different kind of society. It's not that they did not know that there is such a thing as a printing press, right? In India, the news may have arrived later, but in Turkey, they knew very well. They had diplomatic relations with the Europeans. They had embassies. They went back and forth. They were a competitor and a contemporary civilization to the Habsburgs and the French monarchy and whatever. And they were not unaware of what is happening in Europe. And yet they did not take up these things. And it's not just printing. It's just a general attitude towards scientific knowledge, towards development of science. And that just didn't take off in these areas. This is an endless discussion. I think that people have very, very different theories about this, and we'll see what Jay has to say. But yeah, it's true that these people were not heading in that direction at all. They were like, what did they do with their surplus, right? They gave themselves rubies and diamonds and built peacock thrones and whatever, or they built giant monuments, sort of vanity monuments, Taj Mahal and huge mausoleums and whatever. But not a single university, not a single seat of learning like that. This was not their direction.
Jay, your thoughts?
I think one of the points raised by Umar Saab that the fact that Europe has a landed aristocracy, which was firmly established had deep roots in the land, and also feudalism. I think although it has a bad press, but in some cases these feudal lords were much more secure compared to, let's say, the governors of Delhi Sultanate. So in that case, I think they had much more an incentive to develop their feudal fiefdom. So in that case, so this part I think is one of the main reasons why Europe was able to become much more advanced.
Right. And wrapping up the episode, comments and thoughts on some of the prominent Hindu kingdoms, especially the Rajputs who resisted Delhi Sultanate, what was happening in that part of the country. Jay, you want to start with that?
When the Delhi Sultanate was established, so the main center of power of the Chauhans was Delhi and particularly Ajmer. So what we see is that it was the Chauhans who really, first who fought with the first these Turks. And when the Delhi Sultanate was established, Ranthambore became one of the major powers that really, tried to. That there was this great tussle between the Ranthambore rulers and the Delhi Sultanate. So, as I have already mentioned, that Iltutmish had conquered it, but after the death of Iltutmish, the Chauhans had retaken Ranthambore, and there is this text Hamir Mahakavya. So we are told that during this process of reconquest of Ranthambore, there is this mention of the use of cannons by the Rajputs, and this is an interesting point because most of the scholars who have worked on this military aspect of the Delhi Sultanate. So in Amir Khusro's account, we are told that when Alauddin Khilji tried to conquer tried to conquer Ranthambore. So during the siege of Ranthambore, the Rajputs had employed cannons, and the modern scholars argue that this was because, first of all, the reason why, according to the Persian sources, that Alauddin Khilji tried to conquer Ranthambore was because some of the Mongols had taken shelter in Ranthambore. So the recent scholarship argues that these Mongols had, were the ones who were using cannons and gunpowder. But the fact that, before Alauddin's invasion, but after the death of Iltutmish, we have a Sanskrit text that talks about the use of gunpowder and cannon, is an interesting fact, and it also shows that maybe the Rajputs had this knowledge because there was this contact between the Mughals and the Rajputs. Now, this fact is just a speculation because there is no actual evidence for us. But I think this is an interesting speculation. So first is Ranthambore, and Ranthambore is really a great power because what we see is that even Balban, there was this 2 unsuccessful attempt that Balban undertook, but he failed in both of these attempts. And even the Jalaluddin Khilji, so he tried to conquer Ranthambore, but the reasoning is quite interesting. So the Persian sources tell us that Jalaluddin Khilji wanted to, he did not wanted to even the single hair of a Muslim should be harmed. So because in order to avoid this harm, he did not try to conquer Ranthambore. So this is the explanation that is given by Persian scholars. But the fact remains that Jalaluddin was not able to conquer Ranthambore, and it was only during the time of Alauddin Khilji that Ranthambore was conquered. And interestingly, 2 generals of one general, I think, died in this siege, and this siege continued up to more than a year. So Ranthambore and the conquest of Ranthambore is an interesting phase in this resistance towards Delhi Sultanate. Then after Ranthambore, we have Mewar. So I think most of us in popular culture, it is well known that Alauddin Khilji conquered Mewar. And after his conquest, he put his son, whose name is Khizr Khan, over the fort of Chittor as some type of a military ruler. But this rule of the Khiljis did not last long, and Rana Hamir. So this was another Hamir who, after the death of Ratan Singh, so who died fighting Alauddin Khilji. So this Hamir reconquered the land of the Mewar, territory of the Mewar. And after Hamir, I think one of the most important ruler of Mewar is Rana Kumbha. So Rana Kumbha ruled from 1433 to 1468. And one of the interesting aspects of this reign is that he was able to conquer Ajmer, and even Ranthambore, which was earlier part of the Delhi Sultanate, was reconquered during his reign. And if we look at the reign of, or the realm of his, it was quite significant, and it posed a great threat to the Delhi Sultanate. So, and finally we have Rana Sangha, who also defeated one of the Sultanate rulers of Gujarat, who was a Muslim ruler, and Eastern Malwa. So I think these are the rulers of Mewar, and we have finally Marwar. So Jodhpur was established during this period. So the period is, I think, around middle of 15th century, and Bikaner was also established during this period. And although this ruler of Marwar, Maldev, comes in a later period, but these Rajput rulers, and although we do not talk about the fact some of the smaller rulers of the Gangetic plains, and mainly because we do not have enough reference, but these rulers had put up a great fight, if although we do not have great sources about them because they did not write their own history. So one of the reasons why it is not well known is because of this.
Right. Omar Saab, how in the popular imagination and the way history is taught in Pakistan are the Rajputs looked at? In Indian,
I think
obviously, they are a very...
they're always there as the other, the people that the Delhi Sultanate and then the Mughals are trying to subjugate, or at least Mughals up to Akbar. After that, they were less of a factor. But at the same time, I don't think they're specifically demonized or anything. They're just treated as the enemy that were defeated. They're not. I mean, they're mentioned because the Hindu kind of side of India, there is no other name until Shivaji that comes up as an opponent, right? When you think of opponents to the Delhi Sultanate or the early Mughals, it's always going to be Rajputs. But there's no specific like systematic demonization or anything. The demonization is general demonization of Hindus, but not specifically of Rajputs. If anything, they are a little bit honored because they were fighters who fought and lost, but at least they fought.
Also, one thing which I would also like to mention is that by the time of, let's say, Mughals, what we also see that some of the terminologies and even tactics the Rajputs had, adopted from the Turks. So there was the fact that these two powers were fighting. So the Rajputs also learned much from the Delhi Sultanate, and especially the Turks, and how one should fight, especially the cavalry aspect of the warfare.
Right. Closing comments. We start with you, Omar Saab. The legacy of this age. How should we sort of think of Delhi Sultanate?
Before that, maybe just a minute, Jay. Manish, I have a question for Jay. So these Rajputs we talk about, like mostly we assume they to be occupying the Gujarat, Rajasthan, and at max to Haryana, Punjab, or Delhi region. But what is the legacy of the Rajputites, like maybe other Kshatriya leaders from UP or Bihar? Like, did they convert, or like what is their legacy till now? Or did they become zamindars, feudal lords? Like,
I think the Rajputs of, let's say, the Eastern Belt particularly, we do not have, first of all, these were not great, houses. Most of these were small kingdoms. And because of this, we do not have enough reference to study and how they reacted. So because of the limitations of sources, we have a rather vague picture of what happened during this period. So I think there is no straight answer to this, but what I would say is that this concept of they themselves believed to be of Kshatriya origin, and also there are some reference which suggest that they considered themselves, the term Rajput was also used for them. So in that sense, I think one should not differentiate between these two groups. So I think this is the small point.
Yeah, no man. I mean, why do we just getting a bit more into it? So why, is there any theory of why did Rajputs or Hindu kingdoms only manage to survive or thrive in this region and not in the core Gangetic region?
I think
has there been any analysis of that? Because we know during the time of Ghori. So there were a few kingdoms there over, right?
Yes, I think first is the geographical
Kannauj,
reason.
yeah.
Geographical reason. So the Gangetic Plains. So if you have conquered Delhi, and particularly if you have cavalry, most of the plains are open for you. So this military superiority really impacted, particularly had a great impact on the plains, especially. And also, I think that it is not well studied, but and there is also not enough sources. But the early rulers, for example, the Gahadwals, who had control over the region of Uttar Pradesh and parts of Bihar. So I think that this is my theory, and there are no sources. But I think that their rule was much more based on the local small chieftains, rulers, and these rulers, after let's say after the defeat of the Gahadwals in the Battle of Chandwar. So after this, there was no single main power that could unite these. And because of this, I think one of the Delhi Sultanate was able to completely, rule over these regions. But I would say that their rule was contested, and even by the time of Jahangir. So Jahangir, in his accounts, talks about how these Thakurs of Talukdars or of Awadh, they have their own mud fort and they refuse to pay any taxes. And it was only when the imperial army or a small contingent of army goes there, then they would pay their taxes. So this, I think, is an important aspect. And what is also important about this region is that this region also became the center of mercenary soldiers. So so even the rulers of Malwa and even up to the Rajputana. So these rulers greatly employed the Rajput mercenaries of these regions. So this is a fascinating aspect, but sadly, we do not have enough sources about these, so to really understand what was going on during this and in this region.
Right. On to the closing comments, Omar Saab.
Well, I think the Delhi Sultanate, the legacy of the Delhi Sultanate is Pakistan. It's our charter state. We would not exist if there had not been a Delhi Sultanate, right? They introduced Islam into North India and established it strong enough that it is still there. So this was a big contribution. But other than that, and of course, then the other side of it is that they destroyed whatever small states and cultures, the cultural sort of, what would you call it? The North Indian, the Ganga, Jamna, Doab heartland, Hindu heartland lost its vitality, right? And did not recover it, maybe until now even. But that was the legacy of the Delhi Sultanate. Let's see what Jay has to say. He's usually the more sensible speaker.
I think I'm not. But one thing which I think which should be highlighted is the highly unstable nature of the Delhi Sultanate. So there is this, small fact that out of the 32 sultans, 13 died in natural death, 2 by accident, 4 were killed on the battle, 1 was deposed and died a private citizen, while as many as 12 sultans were murdered or died in confinement. So I think this fact that of the 32 rulers, 12 were murdered. This shows, how unstable this polity was. And although it was militarily, if you see, it was certainly quite successful. But on a more, the kind of, let's say, the impact the Mughals had, the fact that both of these, from let's say 1206 AD to 1526 AD, we have a period of 320 years. And this 320-year period does not did not provide any great achievements even in terms of monuments, because even if you look at Delhi, I don't think apart from, let's say, Qutub Minar, there is very great advances that took place in terms of architecture. So in that sense, I think Delhi Sultanate was more of a military state compared to the Mughals. Mughals were much more, and this was also because they were more accommodative compared to the Delhi Sultanate.
Also, I think they pretty much finished off the elite Jainism and Buddhism in North India. Would that be a fair submission, Jay?
No. Jainism survived in Western India, and because the Rajput rulers greatly patronized Jains, and even in Sindh, it was one of the important centers of Jains in Sindh. But yes, and even in the Braj region, Jains were an important population, and even during this up to this period, they were an important period, because I have a PhD colleague who works on the Jains of Braj. So I think if he listens that, he would be.
I think then I stand corrected. My comment is more a judgment than of the present day demographic spread of Jains, because I can't imagine a Jain in present day Pakistan.
Alauddin Khilji also is said to have had, according to some historians, some friendly relations with some Jains. I don't know how reliable those things are. I actually have a friend, a Jain friend, who claims Rajput ancestry, like he was a Rathore before. So he became Jain in like 15th, 16th century, something along that. So they were still there in North India proper.
And till the current dispensation decided to change the name, the ground on which they played international cricket matches in Delhi was called Firozshah Kotla. So yeah, that's how the Sultanate still survives, I guess.
Also, I think one aspect we didn't touch is the fact that Iltutmish first tried to place the iron pillar in the Quwwatul Islam or Might of Islam mosque, and after that we find Firozshah Tughlaq transporting these two Ashokan pillars. One was placed at Firozshah Kotla. So some scholars argue that they tried to connect themselves to the previous rulers of India, but I would say that
could they read it actually?
Yes, there is also this funny story that when Tughlaq transported this pillar from, I think it was in Meerut. So from Meerut it was transported to Firozshah Kotla, and when so in order to read this strange inscription, he asked one of the Brahmins to read it. So if I remember correctly, the story goes that this Brahman said that only a great ruler would be able to place this pillar in this location. So it mentions that this is the prediction. So most likely this ruler was this Iltutmish. So this is a funny incident about the iron pillar. Sorry, not iron pillar, Ashokan pillar.
Right. With that, we come to the end of this episode. I would like to remind our listeners that as part of episode notes, we'll post reference materials and links to books and papers that our speakers have used as part of this conversation. Thank you for your time, gentlemen. Thank you, Omar Saab. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Gaurav.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.